Just a second, let me confirm that we are online on YouTube.
YouTube, recording?
Not yet. I will ask José Otávio if he could start the live transmission, please.
Já começou, Marcelo.
Started already. Okay, because on my screen it doesn't show. Live. Okay, now we are online. Perfect.
Online.
So,
Let's
José,
start.
please. Yes, we can start.
Okay.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. We are starting our 10th webinar, RedeSist of this year, and it is a special pleasure to have this webinar that will be given by our friend, Dr. Catherine Sauviat. It's a huge pleasure, Catherine, and we thank you very much for accepting to give a seminar. And the theme of your presentation is particularly important for everybody and for us at RedeSist, because it goes very deep in our main discussion here during this terrific, terrible times that we are going through, the pandemic, which is affecting lives of everybody, because everybody has friends, relatives that suffered a lot because of this. And within this huge crisis in capitalism, we have this acute crisis, and the analysis that Catherine and her friends at IRES have done about policy reactions of different countries is particularly important. I'll pass the word to Professor Marcelo Matos, who will moderate our section. Please, Professor Matos. I think his microphone is off.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Good afternoon to those in Europe. I will moderate our webinar today. Just some quick information. We're planning to have a presentation by Professor Catherine. And after that, we will have also some PPTs for the comments of our Professor Maria Lucia Falcon. And after that, we can start some kind of debate. Eventually, Catherine would like to react to the comments and questions of Maria Lucia. And after that, we will be able to open to questions from the audience. And you could inform me in the chat that you want to make a question speaking directly, or you can paste a question in the chat. If you do not feel so comfortable to place the question in English, you can place it in Portuguese, and I will try some kind of real-time translation, and let's see what comes out of that, so that we can have some interaction more deeply. Before passing the word to Professor Catherine, let me please shortly introduce her, so those who are not familiar with her work to get to know her a little better. Professor Catherine Sauviat is a senior economist at IRES. I just noticed the pronunciation of José. I didn't know how to pronounce it. Which is a think tank publicly funded that provides trade unions with economic and social research. She is a chief editor of Chronique Internationale, one of IRES publications, and a regular contributor on the US economic and social situation for this journal. She has been put at the disposal of IRES since 1986 from the Commissariat Général du Plan, now called France Stratégie. a governmental agency in charge of advising the Prime Minister on economic topics. She was associate professor at the University of Rennes from 2008 to 2017, and her main topics of research are corporate governance, corporate restructuring, industrial policy, economic and financial globalization, and its effects on labor relationships. And she has also a very interesting list of contributions in books, articles, and journals, which we can put at the disposal of the audience. I think we should get started in not reading the many interesting publications which are on the crisis in the US, the social model of the US, financial mondialization, financing of innovation, topics like labor and social security, corporate governance, labor market, institutions, global supply chain. So some very interesting topics with broad perspective of different issues in the field of economics and social sciences. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us. And welcome, Professor Catherine. I will put your presentation on. Please, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. It's also a great pleasure for me to be with you and to make this presentation, which, as you can see in the title, is mainly about the first wave of the pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic, and which is based on a special issue of the publication you quoted, Chronique Internationale de l'IRES. It's based on the analysis of 9 countries, 6 European countries, 3 extra-European countries, the US, Argentina, and China, and also the European Union. I must say that the choice for countries, although constrained by the knowledge capacities of the IRES researchers on foreign countries, was made regarding two criteria. First, to select different type of healthcare systems as identified by comparative political science studies. And second, to point out the transnational dimension of this pandemic by selecting countries in different continents or part of the world, except unfortunately Africa, for which we don't have partners. Next, yeah. So we focused in this study on the sanitary dimension of the crisis. So, in other words, the economic effects of the crisis is not are not at the main focus of this special issue, and we focused also on the role of the state at different levels, and notably executive powers in healthcare as a regulator, of course, of healthcare services, and also professionals, as a provider of care, but also in charge of more globally of the national security and the protection of the population, of their populations. Next, please. So our purpose was not exactly to evaluate the performances of government responses, but rather to compare them. And to compare them as a result of specific institutional arrangements that design healthcare systems and policies in these different countries. So to consider the diversity of national health systems, we referred to the typology elaborated by Michael Moran from at the end of the 90s and the early 2000s. Michael Moran is a political scientist from Manchester University, and his typology refers to the type of state intervention in three fields, three main fields: the consumption of care, or the conditions of access to care. That means health coverage, organization of healthcare delivery, etc. Healthcare coverage and funding. The regulation of healthcare. Second, the regulation of healthcare suppliers, hospital, doctors, and also the organization of the healthcare delivery. And three, the regulation of the medical industry, of innovation and funding, which is a field that is not hidden, but not highlighted in many studies. So, next, please. So some preliminary observation about comparative statistical data. Most of the countries have built indicators so as to follow the evolution of the pandemic, the number of cases, the death rates, the number of people in intensive care, etc. But this type of data are inappropriate when they are used for cross-country comparison, because definitions, sources, registration of these cases, of these deaths, etc., the observation field also are often very different from one country to another. So the most reliable indicator is by far the excess mortality rate, estimated in reference to the average number of deaths observed on a given period of time during recent years, often the last 5 years. And it's interesting because it takes into account a number of structural factors explaining the morbidity of each country, population, and even sometimes some indirect consequences of the pandemic. So let us say that it's not a perfect indicator, but it has less cross-country comparability limitation than other indicators. Next, please. So you have this table about the excess cumulative mortality during week 10 to 26 of 2020. So as you can see on the left side of the graph, which is not a table, actually it's a graph, in the US, so from March to July 2020, it means that excess mortality, which is known technically as P-score, was superior to 20% compared with excess mortality observed during the same period of the 5 previous years. That is 2015 to 2019. Meanwhile, in Europe, as you can see, it was nearly 16%. And after that, you have the details by country. And for some countries, you can see that excess mortality was very high, like Spain, more than 36%. England and Wales, nearly 35%. Italy, around 26%. France has been in the middle, but some countries from Eastern Europe and also Northern European countries have a P-score at less than 5%. Next, please. So, what about the restriction and lockdowns? Most countries chose lockdown as an obvious or as a privileged tool to flatten the curve, as they said, except Sweden, of course, as you know. Lockdown started with China, where the central government decided to put the entire population of Wuhan in quarantine on January the 23rd. It was the largest lockdown in history. And after that, the whole population of the Hubei province. Only Sweden, with a population of around 10 million inhabitants, has chosen a laissez-faire approach, has refused to close primary schools, kindergartens, or to ban people from leaving their homes, contrary to the other European countries. But its COVID-19 death rate per person was at some point one of the highest in Europe, as you know. The goal of lockdown was to stop as much virus transmission as possible in order not to overload hospitals and to spread out over time the number of persons infected. Lockdowns have been decided by executive powers, and most of the time at the national level, except for the US, where Donald Trump led governors at the forefront of the pandemic. For China, where local governments had much leeway to decide quarantine of a whole city, as well as for Germany, where the Länders have been responsible for the decision of lockdown. But contrary to the US, the central government in Germany played a strong role of coordination. And one final point, executive powers mobilize their population through a campaign of communication in order to reassure people in their capacity to control the situation, and also as a means to produce collective and political consent, given the high economic cost of lockdowns, in terms, of course, of economic and political freedom, but it's also evidence of some sort of total improvisation in the field of public health. Next, please. The degree and forms of restrictions differed among healthcare states. For example, in Germany, the central government was able to negotiate with the Länder, while the US saw no coordination, as I mentioned before, at all, no coordination at all between the central executive power and the state governors. So lockdowns and all sorts of restrictions generally reinforce the role of national and central governments. For example, in France or even in England, in Ireland, their role, the role of central governments, was reinforced by emergency legislation and the capacity to impose harsh and uniform restriction at a national level. On the contrary, where competencies are shared between a different level of institution inside a country, restrictions were less severe. were, let's say, more negotiated in countries like Germany or even Argentina, as we could learn because by our partner who wrote the article, and sometimes also vary among regions, like in Italy or in China. So the role of central government was also reinforced by the setting up of national scientific task forces in order to legitimize lockdowns and that lockdowns which have been proliferating, I would say, by imitation. Next, please. So the exposure to the virus was a sort of dead angle in the literature about the pandemic. This exposure is, of course, related to living and social conditions, and the vulnerability to COVID-19 exposure depended also on access to healthcare, access to health insurance first, to insurance coverage. That was expanded in almost all countries. For example, COVID-19 testing and treatments became free of charge in most of the countries analyzed, not without loopholes, of course. And age also was another factor of discrimination. Not only were elderly people particularly vulnerable to dangerous form of COVID-19 illness, but they were also very badly treated in nursing homes, I must say, in most of the countries. In the UK, for example, elderly infected persons have been transferred from hospital to nursing homes, and that's why you've got this high rate of mortality in nursing homes. And last point of this slide, all countries experience some sort of disparities regarding the diffusion of the virus, but with disproportional impacts on poor and racial minorities. The phenomenon of racial disparity is pretty well documented, of course, in the US and in the UK, where ethnic minorities are much more scrutinized than in a country like France, for example, where statistics are forbidden to treat them particularly. So in the US, COVID-19 struck disproportionately African American and also Latinos, which are people also overrepresented in frontline occupations. In the UK, a study also concluded that Black people and immigrants from South Asia had a higher risk of getting infected and an exposure to death twice higher than white people. But inequalities were also visible in France. For example, for those who know France, those who know France, La Seine-Saint-Denis, which is in the periphery of Paris, and which is one of the poorest administrative area, was hit particularly. And also, of course, as you can imagine, France ultramarine territories like Mayotte or near Brazil, Guyanas. While poor people, of course, are also overrepresented. But it concerns also, for example, Sweden, where COVID-19 has hit ethnic minorities like Syrians or Somalis particularly hard. Next, please. So when attention was paid, when some countries paid attention to inequalities, it was mostly by guaranteeing financial access to care and ensure affordability, either by enlarging the scope of the coverage, of health coverage. So you have a lot of countries, of the countries analyzed here, that have changed their rules related to care funding in order to guarantee access to coverage and sometimes to care for people with low income. In Argentina, for example, particular attention was paid to vulnerable population from the poor suburbs of Buenos Aires, periphery, and also from disadvantaged provinces in terms of medical capacities. A strategy of tracing and isolating was implemented in shanty towns by the federal government and the provincial governments. The focus on public action on poor people, of course, can also be explained by the particular sensitivity of the leftist government that was recently elected there, I suppose. But as I mentioned earlier, attention was very poorly paid in all countries to the elderly people in nursing homes. In nearly all countries, at least 90% of COVID-19 deaths were amongst people aged 60 and over. And in most countries, understaffed nursing homes represent between 40 and 50% of reported deaths. Next, please. So, what were the main measures of the countries analyzed here to try to flatten the curve? Because all countries, of course, experience a surge in demand for healthcare services, and notably hospital care, because of the highly contagious novel coronavirus and the severe forms of pathology it implied. But hospitals were particularly ill-prepared to the surge of the pandemic everywhere, almost everywhere. After decades of budgetary pressures, after decades of reforms aimed at reducing costs through minimal investment, at reducing public hospital bed capacities, and with the only exception of Germany. I will come back. So in Europe, these hospital reforms occurred since the 1980s, but I must say that the budget pressures increased dramatically after the Great Recession of the 2008 and 9. And they took the form of privatization. We can say two forms of privatization, kind of internal privatization, in the sense that private management principles were introduced in the management of public hospitals, and a competition, externalization of healthcare services, and also they tended to push hospitals towards just-in-time, lean management, moving some services into more accessible locations that are cheaper to operate. And concretely, it implied the reduction of a lot of intensive care units beds, of equipment also, of course. But this principle of lean management applied also to the healthcare workforce, notably the nurses, which was reduced as well. So it turned out that hospitals were suffering when the outbreak came. They were suffering from insufficient ECU beds, intensive care unit beds, and also insufficient supply of skilled staff. And all public officials called for, at one point, a redistribution of hospital beds by adding extra ECU beds, by deprogramming elective surgeries, by mobilizing military hospital, sorry, by converting some other places in healthcare facility, etc., etc. Sorry. So coordinated action by central authorities took place to organize the transfer of some of patients between regions, even between countries, in order to relieve some hospitals from being overloaded or for being swamped. It has been the case in France, for example, but also in England and the UK. In Germany, the government required hospitals issue beds to give in real time the availability of bed capacity within each lander. It was much more difficult in the US because the central government had a very weak control over the hybrid, but also very powerful hospital system that impeded de facto the creation of such a national system of collecting and sharing information, data about the availability of beds in an emergency situation. In Wuhan, as you probably know, also a new hospital emerged at the end of January. Other makeshift hospitals were built in 2 weeks, funding by charities and by the central government. But only patients tested positively were admitted in these hospitals, while test tracing and selecting the patient, while testing capacity were very limited. And of course, in China, local community volunteers were mobilized for tracing and selecting the patients admitted to hospitals. Next, please. So countries sought to mobilize additional workforce, additional staff very quickly, often by recalling inactive and retired health professionals, but also mobilizing medical and nursing students nearing the end of their studies, by easing licensure requirements for practitioners. France, for example, mobilized also its sanitary reserve made of health professionals, non-care hospital workers, professionals from regional health agencies. China, who until the 20th of January denied the reality of the epidemic, redeploy this healthcare workforce to correspond to the new hospital capacities. So adding new healthcare workers was one way, but also intensifying the workload of health professionals were the other way to expand supply. Nurses were particularly affected. They were required to work more hours per day. The ratio nurses to patient was downgraded, and they received few gratification. And also, this additional work was done without the appropriate protection, personal protective equipment that would have been required to protect these healthcare workers. So I must say also that this first wave of the pandemic was not very propitious for conflicts or even collective bargaining. Sometimes the conflicts were happened before the pandemic, but during the pandemic there were not that many conflicts. And last point, the mobilization of primary care and the coordination with hospital orchestrated by central government was actually very weak, not to say quasi-inexistent in some cases, and it was the case in most countries, apart maybe from Ireland. But in France, for example, primary care doctors were not mobilized for the screening of suspected COVID-19 patients, even if some healthcare professionals initiatives emerge, of course. Next, please. So this pandemic has put a challenge for industrial and innovative systems. So when it comes to equipment and to supplies necessary to fight COVID-19 pandemic, all countries experienced. When I say all countries, it's all countries of our analysis, of course. All countries experienced shortages, as you know, probably masks, ventilators, testing kits, chemicals that go into them, etc. The shortage were more or less important, but there was a shortage everywhere. Even in the US, which is considered as the example of the supply state. I mean, that is a state which is dominated by healthcare professionals, by hospitals, and by the medical equipment as well. So they faced a major shortage of medication needed for COVID-19 patients. They faced shortage of personal protective equipment. They faced shortage of ventilators, of medical gas, all kinds of supplies, of essential supplies. Maybe an exception was Germany, who was able to test early and to avoid a harsh, uniform lockdown all over the country. As you probably know, Germany was able to carry out many more coronavirus tests than other countries since the start of the crisis, and led the way in Europe for this. Huh? The pandemic shed lights also on the dependency of many advanced countries upon a very limited number of suppliers, frequently upon China, to procure critical products. And it turned out that supply chains created risks for national sanitary security and have come to be seen as a source of fragility, while public policy have been primarily guided by answering to the need for protection and security. So countries also sought ways to boost domestic medical equipment production. In the US, for example, Donald Trump, as you probably know, ordered different companies, automotive companies, to produce ventilators, for example, etc. In Wuhan, in China, state-based companies of the province and of other provinces were mobilized on a voluntary basis, but it was also the case for some private companies, etc., etc. Next, please. So those shortage of equipment highlighted the high degree of interdependence in trade of COVID-19 related products. Export and imports of medical goods are concentrated in a few countries. 3 countries are responsible for 35% of total world of medical product export: Germany, the US, and Switzerland, and around 34% of total world of medical product imports. As you know, China is specialized in medical consumables and protective garments. Meanwhile, OECD countries are specialized in medical devices. The United States and Germany are specialized in the relatively high tech medical device sector or segment, while rather low-cost production hubs such as China are leading producer of less technology sophisticated personal protective equipment products like masks, etc. Except Singapore, which is exporting a lot of world respirators and ventilators, much more than China. A last point is that a recent publication of RedeSist mapping the bilateral intra-industry trade in COVID-19 products highlights, however, that developing countries are more dependent on OECD and G20 countries for access to COVID-19 goods, and that trade of such products among them is rather limited. Next, please. So there were some innovative responses, but also some failures, and I will give you 2 examples coming from the US that I study more particularly. First, the experience of a successful partnership in Massachusetts between researchers, between manufacturing companies and healthcare institutions, which is particularly interesting, I think, and particularly regarding your interest as the interest of RedeSist research focus on local productive and innovation systems. An issue of the New England Journal of Medicine from May 2020 shortly documented this experience. But briefly, it's the story of a state economic development agency, which is called the MASTEC, which is in charge of strengthening the regional tech and innovation economy. That formed on purpose the Manufacturing Emergency Response Team. He found this team that is, he built build up a group of volunteer academic researchers from RD and engineering, mainly, manufacturing companies, and healthcare institution. And this group managed to establish complaint testing procedures for fabrics, gowns, face shields, masks, and swabs, and to assess the demand for this kind of personal protective equipment and other material needed. So it enabled the Massachusetts-based supply chains to become permanent and to establish a domestic source, a local source of medical supplies for testing, for patient care and production. And the second example is about the failure of the US government and a private company partnership to deliver affordable and flexible ventilators. So this is a point I won't develop here, since it was the focus of Bill Lazonic's presentation in the RedeSist seminar last September. But it showed the extent to which company concentration, tax optimization, and company financialization have prevented the US government to build the strategic stockpile of ventilators that would have been critical during the pandemic. Next, please. So, lessons for the second wave. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed the insufficient preparation of nearly all countries to cope with the major public health emergency. It implied, I would say the same degree of improvisation, more or less. So, new explosion of caseload and back to lockdowns. In October, new COVID-19 cases exploded again at a rate grows faster than during the first wave. COVID-19 is resurging everywhere except in China, that is celebrating the end of the pandemic. Within countries, COVID-19 is resurging all over the territory this time. There are no more or much less regional clusters. In Italy, for example, Italy Southern Mezzogiorno had been relatively protected from COVID-19 first wave and had suffered far fewer infection and deaths than the north. But now the virus is spread all over Italy, while the hospital system in the south is much less performing. In early November, a new round of restriction came into force in Europe and in the US, with always the same, I would say, old and sort of archaic methods, which are lockdowns, coming maybe from the Middle Age, the time of Black Death. Even Sweden, which has rejected the lockdown in the first wave, has introduced its first mandatory restrictions. However, second wave restriction remain less restrictive and more targeted this time, since states decided to close, not to close schools, for example, or different places. Yet restrictions are, it's interesting because restrictions are raising more opposition everywhere, from lawsuits in Germany to riots and demonstrative flouting of the rules in Italy. The social acceptance of this restriction is fading, and some small businesses, for example, are refusing to cooperate. And everywhere, opposition parties that supported governments during the first wave in the spring now question whether the new constraints are worth the economic cost. Next, please. So you have seen the same methods that during the first wave, and the same situation, of course. Hospital capacity is near saturation again, and there was no creation during these two waves. No creation of permanent ICU beds, for example, and also you have these strong inequalities, territorial inequalities in hospital capacities, which have been more visible during the second wave because it's spread all over the country. And also, I must say that the healthcare workforce has not recovered from the first wave, and more and more absenteeism is observed now in a lot of countries. Also, the testing, tracing, isolating strategy is limited because of the limitation of screening and diagnostic testing capacity in the US and Europe as well. And it's all but surprising that testing data remains very weak in a supply healthcare like the US 8 months into the pandemic. And final point, East Asian countries have been example of a very successful strategy. Taiwan, Singapore, that we don't analyze, but Vietnam, South Korea were able to implement early and massive testing, tracing, and isolating infected person, and then to control the COVID-19 outbreak. And some of them were even able to avoid lockdowns. But I think in Asia, the efficiency of the strategy has certainly something to do with their previous experiences with the SARS epidemic of 2003, and also with of course, the population consent to be traced and filmed permanently, which is not maybe the case in Europe. Next, please. So, one word to the race to vaccines led by biotech. You know, of course, that several front runners are racing to deliver a COVID-19 vaccine, but biotech firms took the lead in innovation, even if they had to ally to pass alliances with large drug manufacturers. You have nearly 50 or around candidates based on different technologies which are in clinical trials and the last stage phases. Some of them are more advanced, of course, but in the race, the US Pfizer and German BioNTech companies are in the lead. Also, the US biotech Moderna, which could follow, since its vaccine has been found to be almost 90-95% or something effective in phase 3 trials. If biotech firms drive R&D for vaccines, their massive production and distribution rests upon big pharma. But mass production capacities of big pharma companies are also limited. Once again, the US as a supply, which is a supply healthcare taste, makes the difference. For example, a partnership between the Department of Health, the Department of Defense, and the private sector has been set up to speed up development and distribution of vaccine, and the pace and development and scope of such a vaccine effort is certainly unprecedented. So these new vaccines, this new technology vaccine, messenger RNA, require cold chains and special freezers for transportation, as you know, and it's a precondition that will be initially complicated for the delivery to developing countries, I guess. In contrast, the AstraZeneca vaccine has proved to be more suitable, maybe for emerging and developing country, since it can be stored at normal fridge temperature. One other point is the resistance to vaccines. A large percentage of people in the countries analyzed seem hesitant to get the shot. That means that public trust in vaccines tend to decrease in developed nations. In France, in particular, a recent survey showed that 43% of the population would be resistant to get vaccinated, which is an important, huge rate against the coronavirus. It is 7 points more than in the US, 12 points more than in Germany, and again, and more than 20 points more than in the UK. And also a recent article of the Washington Post, I think, quoted a British study pointing out that vaccines face trust gap in Black and Latino communities. And final part, access to vaccines for whom? First problem is the question of price. A lot of public money, as you know, has been poured into vaccine development, but drug makers have been reluctant to announce how they will price a shot. Of course, pressure of civil society has pushed them to disclose some prices, but these prices seem to vary widely among companies. A second problem is due to the pre-reservation made by industrialized countries. The vast majority of Pfizer and BioNTech doses, for example, have already been secured by richer nations. The 20 million doses of the Moderna vaccine should be reserved also to the US, and German biotech firms who receive grants from the German government must make also a certain amount of doses available to the German government. However, several initiatives have taken place to support global access to vaccines. That's the case for the coalition of, as you know, for epidemic preparedness innovation, the global partnership launched in 2017 called Gavi, the UN-backed Vaccine Alliance, the Gates Foundation, the COVAX, which is a World Health Organization program that are about to guarantee the delivery of millions of doses to poor countries. So my conclusion, next please. So the first point, there is a need, I think, to take the precaution principle very seriously to face chronic disease and future chronic disease, and to promote coordinated action at the international level. As Martin Wolf pointed out in a recent Financial Times paper, global challenges need global solution. That means reinforcing the role of the World Health Organization. A notable fact during the surge of COVID-19 disease was that national authority, except German authority, have been very rarely following the 2005 updated WHO Global Influenza Preparedness Plan and all its recommended actions. On the contrary, we saw heterogeneous national initiatives and responses taking place. Second, a need for improved health data collection and exchange. It means accelerating digital solutions. It means collecting large-scale and good quality data through electronic health records. It means creating data sharing platforms to support new products, new services. And it can concern a lot of fields, such as preventive medicine, such as precision medicine, such as digital surgery, etc., etc. For example, telemedicine has been particularly helping for the continuity of care during the pandemic. But this orientation addresses the question of controlling such data. Health data should not be left under the control of the platform economy, as François Chenet pointed out in a previous RedeSist webinar. Third, a need for more resilient health systems. I would say that if absolute prevention or avoidance of shocks such as COVID-19 is impossible, given the unpredictable nature of systemic threats, it should be stressed that the pressures to reduce idle bed capacities and healthcare spending led to unpreparedness to the pandemic and to a lot of death that could have been avoided. The acute shortage of health professionals must be tackled, as well as expanding health insurance coverage. A recent OECD report or survey points out the need to invest more in healthcare workforce and hospital bed capacities after having said the contrary for years. Furthermore, investing in healthcare as a public service would allow to push for the development of a sector, the health care industry, which is less energy consumer than other industries. And last, a need to make vaccines global common goods. So even as you probably saw, even the G20 communique recognized the role of extensive immunization as a global public good and the need to ensure cheap and global access to COVID-19 vaccines. The question remains how it will be done, since there is private corporate control of the supply. How many doses each country will reserve for their own population and how many they will release to the COVAX scheme, for example. How to secure the necessary billion of doses in an affordable and timely way for poor countries, while wealthy countries have cut separate deals for their own citizens. And of course, it tackles the more general question of suspending global enforcement of intellectual property rights involving the virus. So thank you for your attention and for having shared some of this reflection with the
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I will just pass the word to Professor Maria Lucia Falcon for her to giving a short presentation with comments on your presentation and some questions. Let me first introduce Professor Maria Lucia Falcon. She has a career dedicated to development planning, public policies, regional and urban development, and local innovation production systems. She has a degree in agronomy from the Federal University of Bahia in '82, a master in economics from the Federal University of Bahia in '90, and a PhD in sociology from the University of Brasilia in 2000. She was a professor at the Federal University of Sergipe between '91 and 2016, working mainly on public planning and budget, regional economy, urban development, culture, and territory. She was a planning secretary of Aracaju between 2001 and 2006, planning secretary of the state of Sergipe from 2007 to 2010, a national secretary of planning and strategic investment of the Ministry of Planning in 2011, secretary of urban development and the state of Sergipe from 2012 to 13, advisor of the presidency of BNDES of our development bank from 2014 to 15, president of INCRA from 2015 to 2016, advisory of the government of Bahia, coordinating the first employment program and the Bahia 2035 program development plan between 17 and 18. And now currently she is a visiting researcher at the University of Santiago de Compostela at the Faculty of Economic Sciences in the area of regional development. So with this vast and interesting experience, it will be a pleasure to hear your comments and enrich our debate. Please, Professor Maria Lucia, the stage is yours. I will right away put on your PPT.
I can't hear.
Thank you, Marcelo. And that's why I'm a bit tired. We have done so much. Okay, hello, everybody. My gratitude to RedeSist for this opportunity to discuss with Catherine and my colleagues the responses of a selected group of countries to the health crisis that is impacting the world this year. I especially thank Professors Cassiolato, Helena, Marcelo, and Catherine for her brilliant lecture and insights. I'm going to show you some slides that synthesize our research. I say our because Professor Cassiolato is our coordinator, and me and Marina Zafiro are the researchers. The research is about the political way in 5 dimensions. The sample of 15 countries responded to the health crisis and how this crisis gained strength and impacted in other fields, social, economical, technological, and environmental. And of course, I put Brazil in the spotlight during the analysis. The first slide, please, Marcelo. The first slide shows the epidemiological impact of COVID-19 in the first and second waves of contagions and deaths. The figure is from Le Monde, November 24, and shows the moving average of deaths. Brazil and the rest of Latin America, France and the rest of European Union, USA and India have the most difficult stats, despite that the pandemic had begun in China, Asia. We are going to discuss 5 items. Please, Marcelo. Next one. Methodology about healthcare system and financing, about measures during the health crisis, another perspective for the health crisis, and the conclusions. The methodology consisted on, first, select a sample of 50 countries: Brazil, Argentina, USA, Spain, Germany, France, Italy, UK, Russia, China, South Korea, South Africa, India, New Zealand, and Vietnam. Second, collected data from WHO, OECD, IMF, WTO, ILO, Oxford University, Legaron Index, World Bank, and others. Third, proceed to a cross-section analysis considering many aspects of the country's health system and financing, fiscal in the sense of tax and monetary measures, health and management measures, medium and long-term planning. Next, please. It is important to note that the measures focused in the medium term are related for the most part with the technological transformations introduced massively during the pandemic in service like teleeducation, telemedicine, telecommerce, etc. In the world of work, telework and Industry 4.0, in the field of social protection, and in the support offered to the companies for its energy conversion. So, in this slide, we can see 2 illustrations. The first one is about the phases involved in managing the health crisis, that is to say, first, understanding planning, phase 1, community contagion, and phase 2, coexistence with the disease. Communication is important all the time, but during the wave of contagion, the main goal is, like Catherine said, is to flatten the curve. The second illustration organizes the impacts of the health crisis according to the timing of the impact on short term, like direct costs of treatment and deaths, and aggregated demand fall, or medium long term, like loss of human capital, education, fall in public and private investment, other negligences on environmental, social, political, or health areas. Next, please, Marcelo. Item 2, about healthcare system and financing, informs us that the spending on health has different models across the countries, some of them funding from state, others from compulsory or voluntary insurance. Also, we can see that the preceding financial 2008 crisis was paid, in part, with cutting spends on health and other social policies by the OECD countries, especially the Mediterranean ones. Is there a correlation between the weakness of the health system and the epidemiological curve of COVID-19? We do not have the answer yet. Anyway, the stats for Brazil are 43% of the spending in health are from states funding, 27% from compulsory insurance, and 28% voluntary insurance. And the proportion of public health expenditures as a proportion of the total public spending is 10% of the budget. In this comparison between the mode of funding and results on health, next one, please, Marcelo. we can see two illustrations where the USA, next please. That's it. Where the USA is a case of a failure and a lot of spending also. There is a lower longevity expectation and more evitable deaths in this country, despite that it has the most expensive health system in the world. Next one, please. Finally, observing the Legal Prosperity Index Health Ranking 2019, we can see that Brazil, it's the light green. Brazil is among the countries above average. In the sequence, we can see Brazil and other sample countries' punctuations. Next, please. In the pillar of health and the elements prevention and health systems 2019, we can see Brazil with the red sign. And next one, please. That's it. And this illustrates the elements of physical health, mental health, and life expectancy 2019 too. Brazil has a dual situation because the population lives more years, but in not so good health conditions. The public health system, SUS, alone can't transform the social inequality that implies in bad life conditions. Next one, please. Item 3. About measures during the sanitary crisis. There is a framework with 5 types of measures that the countries are adopting in response to the pandemic and its consequences. The majority of them have the support of multilateral organisms like IMF, World Bank, and OECD. That's a new thing. There are management measures, health measures, social measures, tax and monetary measures, and economic measures. For example, management measures, coordinating, planning, and national monitor of the disease. Health measures, reduced mobility and social distancing. Social measures, maintain effective demand and basic consumption of families through emergency aid or permanent minimum income, and so on. All of those measures were necessary because the lockdown caused a sharp fall of economic activities. In the following graphics, please, we see percentage of workers in countries with business closure standards during the COVID-19 pandemic from January to August 2020. This data is from ILO. We can see the impact initiated in more intensive from March. And of course, the countries adopted measures like assistance coverage, as next one, please. That's it. Assistance coverage as a percentage of the population in the 2020 pandemic. And please observe that South Asian, 39%, and Latin American Caribbean, 35%, reached the highest level of people assisted with cash or in kind. From IMF, initial measures for conservation of jobs. Next one, please, Marcelo. Data from IMF, that's it. We can see the conservation of jobs in OECD countries as a percentage of workers in the 2020 pandemic. And again, we can see the USA, the last one, with anything to see, did not adopt any protection. On the contrary, New Zealand, the first one, adopted the most protected labor market, protecting almost 70% of the jobs. Next one, please, Marcelo. Regarding the climate crisis, the graphic shows climate relevance, greenhouse gas emissions of the tax measures of the OECD countries during the health crisis. Brazil is in the last place, and the investments on processes have a negative footprint. France, Germany, and China are with the best positions on this rank. In short terms, Brazil's response to the pandemic crisis is in a good position when the public spending is focused, but the results are bad in epidemiology as well as economic and social aspects. Next one, please. So, next one, please. So, item 4, another perspective to analyze the health crisis informs us that the countries are confronting a battle in two fields or scales. National scale, such as model of healthcare system, maybe public, private, or mixed. The level of coordination between central and subnational governments. Brazil is one case, special case, Catarina, because the subnational governments adopted a position to defend the public health and the people, and the central government, like Trump, operated like as if nothing was gone. It's insane, but that's it. The level of coordination between central and subnational governments, and finally, cultural behavior, more individualistic or holistic culture. Beyond the country's scale, we must observe A, the capitalist transition to the informational stage of capital accumulation, international coordination of value global chains in health activities, first, and other products and its distribution, second moment, emphasis particularly on renewable energy and ICT. B, the stress of the innovation system to accomplish objectives in the fastest process ever, like the vaccines. Thanks to new technologies like bioinformatics and biochemical simulations, international cooperation, and public-private funds. C, the new role of countries in the international division of labor according to the investment and innovation capacities coordinated by the state. D, social support during the transition for families and firms. Burning of capital and jobs are expected when the accumulation regime changes. Finally, as main conclusions, Marcelo, please. Finally, as main conclusions, I can say that the country's responses to the pandemic and the 2020 economic crisis led to strategic positions in the development path post-crisis. Besides, the multilateral organizations offered a different approach for the state role in this crisis and the 2008 crisis. Some countries are modeling their future with investments in green economy, updating the education system, digital infrastructure, and changing labor regulation for the social challenges that are waiting for us just after turning the corner. For example, cybersecurity, data surveillance, etc. They presented plans, programs, and new policies, but in the first place, they must confront the resistance forces in politics as well as in the economic field. For example, in the European Union, climate and digital plans and law are being discussed in the parliament. In China, the plan 2035 are being discussed in the Communist Party Congress, and so on. Brazil is keeping a step down, and there is a no-show government at the sustainable development theme. As a result, the country is no longer in the rank of the 10 biggest industrial economies, and the poverty inequality is already deepening. No proposals were made by the political parties to society or in the national parliament. No doubt about the multiplier power of spending in health. Data analysis by IMF concluded that for every 1% more spent on health, private investment grows by almost 7%, an impact only surpassed by social assistance, whose rate is almost 10%, and cultural leisure with almost 11%. So the complex or the system of healthcare is very important, not only now because of the pandemic and the health crisis, but always will be important to development of a country. Once more, thank you very much for your attention. And now I present my questions to Catarina. I have 3 questions, Catarina. First one, how do you understand the role of coordination between central and subnational governments during the health crisis and after that in planning the economic recovery? Two, considering the present state of capitalism, is there any space for an isolated country to get over the pandemic and begin an economic growth process without digitization, renewable energy, and innovation? And three, the last one, what about social cohesion after the pandemic in the European Union? Will society finally accept a minimum universal income? Thank you very much.
Okay. What? It's my turn?
Thank you, Professor Maria Lucia, for the questions. I displayed them on the screen for Catherine if she wants to take a look on them. And I pass the word to Professor Catherine for replying to them.
Okay.
And in the meantime, I will take note of someone who wants to make questions after Catherine's response at the chat.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria Lucia, for your presentation and for the questions, for your questions. The first question about the role of coordination between central and subnational government during the health crisis and also the economic recovery. I think that this role of coordination, I think, is critical. From the countries analyzed in our special issue, we have seen opposite strategies of countries with federal regimes. If I take the example of Germany, Germany is a country with what we call a Bismarckian healthcare system. That is where consumption is governed through labor market institutions, labor market locations, and which is financed by payroll taxes. And where health insurance institutions are involved in the implementation of health policies. And so, with this kind of institutional arrangement of the healthcare system, we observe that the central government of Germany was able to negotiate with the Länder, with the regions, that are the ones who are responsible for the development and the funding of hospitals. And we did not observe contradictory responses at a regional level. The federal government played a role of coordination, even if it left the room for, let's say, targeted responses locally. It implemented, and it's very important, this point, it implemented a national sanitary plan aimed at guiding the administration at different levels and at adapting the organization of health structures to the pandemic. And also, we observed that a task force, a crisis task force, was created at the federal level, and health public institutions were involved. Notably, maybe you know the Robert Koch Institute, which gathers epidemiologic data and which offers a technical support to Länder. So all these kind of initiatives, of structures, facilitated the collective adhesion of the population, of the German population, and also of public debate about restriction measures, and allowed targeted restriction measures locally, etc., depending on the degree of spreading of the virus locally, etc. If I take the US, it's a counterexample. The US has also a federal regime, a federal structure, but as I say, the healthcare system is governed dominantly by health suppliers, by hospitals, which are very, very powerful, and also by medical equipment suppliers. And you have this high degree of innovation, of medical technology, etc. But what we saw in the US was no coordination at all between the central executive power, which was Donald Trump also, and the governor of the states. The governor of the states have been the dominant figures of the pandemic response, but they were the ones who chose, and they were the ones who chose when and how to lock down, to lock areas, because of the paralysis of the federal, from the federal government. So the responses from the states have been very heterogeneous and sometimes competitive. Lockdown decisions, for example, have been taken separately, more or less quickly at different time. Some states have taken a few or no measure at all of restriction, not to impede economic activity. For example, the Midwest, all the Midwest states and the Southern states, they didn't take any measure of restriction, or very few. Some other have decided complete restriction. The states that were hit hardly, like the eastern states, the New York, for example, the city of New York, also the municipalities, but also California, for example, and some other states were somewhere in between. But if you come to the shortage of medical equipment, what we saw was states fighting each other, trying to get equipment from the federal government, from Donald Trump, who of course preferred to give the equipment to the Republican states rather than the Democratic states, and also from foreign countries. Of course, they try to get medical equipment from foreign countries, but the states were left on their own. So this lack of coordination for me was a disaster, which can be seen, of course, in the record of infected cases and in the number of deaths from COVID-19 in the US when you compare to other countries. But maybe you could say the not exactly the same for Brazil, but you mentioned also this chaotic situation because the central government and the state. So yes, coordination between these central and sub-national governments is critical. For your second question, that was, is there any space for an isolated country to get over the pandemic and begin an economic growth process without digitalization, renewable energy, and innovation? Here, my answer would be no. I don't think there is room for isolated responses to the pandemic in the context of global capitalism. One feature which was very interesting and in this global pandemic, in this global sanitary crisis, was that we all know the different dimension of globalization, of course, but what we didn't pay attention to was that there is also the global circulation of virus. And unfortunately, faced to this globalization of viruses, unfortunately, this pandemic paved the way for national responses rather than a collective response that would have promoted the community destiny, let's say, of human beings. Of course, governments were in panic, I think, and they largely improvised, as I said, solutions like lockdowns at their level, and we have seen how lockdowns have been imitated, have been sort of mimetic responses to this crisis. China, as I said, ordered a lockdown first of the city of Wuhan, then the province of Hubei, and almost all the countries followed, except Sweden, as I said. But I think in this perspective, I think they acted, as we say in French, they acted à l'aveugle. I think in sort of a blind way, because and this blind way was also because of the high degree of scientific uncertainty about the new virus. But the magnitude of the economic shock is unprecedented, as you say, involving a disruption to both supply and demand, and that reduce, of course, household consumption, that reduce firms' investment, etc. So, what about the process of digitalization, for example, renewable energy and innovation that you addressed? I think digitalization, of course, was already underway, but the pandemic, I think, has accelerated the digitalization of the economy, and the big winners, as you know, of course, are the platform companies, the digital companies. The digital platform economy and its main actors have seen their role strongly reinforced, while on the other side, the role of the state as a sort of final insurer, I would say, has also been rediscovered in terms of supporting revenues, supporting incomes of households and firms also. So from this point of view, I think we can consider that China, as a state-based sort of capitalism, came out strengthened from this crisis. If you look at its very active foreign policy, for example, about vaccines, and the problem, of course, is the degree of social acceptation of such a political regime and of the accompanying measures. So I would say the pandemic highlighted the need to regulate the free market in one side, and maybe rehabilited some sort of, I would say, economic planning, legitimize this sort of economic planning. We need to have planned, to be prepared to this pandemic, to this global disease, etc. And the state also should be at the forefront of producing common goods that capitalism has been unable to produce, and even that were seen as obstacle to the dynamic of capitalist accumulation in a way. So among these kind of common goods, I would say health, and, as you say, Maya Lucia, health and education are very important. And they are important also because they are neither energy-intensive sectors nor big energy consumers. So they could receive public investments without damaging environmental pollution, contrary to other industry, for example. And at a moment where the dramatic economic effects of the pandemic and the urgent need of dealing with its social impact challenges, the need for a rapid ecological transition, I think that investing in these common goods could be a solution, not too costly or less costly, I would say, that other solution. I mean, supporting traditional manufacturing industries that are in general that imply more pollution, etc. And so that would be my answer to your second question. But then coming to your third question about social cohesion and the possibility to accept a minimum universal income. The question is more complicated. I mean, I would say the slowdown of international trade combined with the COVID-19 pandemic led, as you mentioned, to dramatic economic and social crises. And this phenomenon has certainly exacerbated nation rivalry and protectionist reactions that have been seen, and that were already increasing since the big recession of 2008. So the demand for food and health security during the pandemic have prevailed, but have also reinforced protectionist and nationalist responses in another side. For example, states now are more and more considering strategic some industries or some companies to protect them from international competition, for example. So global competition has been intensified, and the risk is to push the richer and more powerful countries to follow their own interest in this rule of the game. This tendency can be even visible in an integrated economic area like the European Union, you know. The sort of technological nationalism which has emerged in rich country, I think is about to be the rule now. Business has become the main vector of political influence. If you look at the conflict, for example, between China and the US, But European Union in this game, I think, is disadvantaged because economic and financial integration in the European Union has prevailed at the expense of political integration, for example. And you can see today within the European countries conflicts emerging between Poland and Hungary, etc. This kind of conflicts. So the emergence of the European Union as a geopolitical force is undermined by these conflicts. That would be a first part of my response. But you can also observe that the European Union response to the pandemic has been a big stimulus package for European Union. I mean, it's 750 billion euros stimulus package. It means that European countries agreed on an embryonic stage of solidarity for the first time, which is quite new for the richest country of the European Union, and for Germany, for example, particularly. So, but in the same way, since the big recession, since 2008, we can see that inequalities in Europe have accelerated. The northern countries have become more and more competitive with large trade surplus and a stronger manufacturing basis, while the southern countries have experiences deindustrialization and increasing unemployment. So the coronavirus pandemic, which created this unprecedented recession, hit disproportionately, as you know, the service industry, where the southern countries of Europe were more specialized, tourism, etc. So it has exacerbated the already existing inequalities and imbalances between Northern and Southern Europe countries. And the problem for the EU now is I would say, its capacity to produce solidarity rather than rivalries between member states. But I would extend this assessment to the world, and I would say that more multilateralism is needed. That is one of the big lessons from this pandemic crisis. The role, for example, of World Health Organization has been marginalized, while it should have been at the forefront of the fight against the pandemic, because it has produced a number of instruments to fight disease. So in this context, is a universal basic income worth considering for European Union countries, for example? I don't think that you can have a global response for your European Union. You can have, I would say, different national responses about establishing such a scheme and also designing it, considering the heterogeneous economic situation of European countries. You probably know that Spanish government has just started an experiment spurred by the coronavirus crisis and its economic collapse. So Spain was one of the hardest hit countries in the early days of the pandemic, and millions of people, as you know, lost their jobs. The economy shrank rapidly, putting many of the most vulnerable workers at risk. And so this experience was launched, and I think it's a good thing. Then you have also in another way, the Finnish experiment. Finland being part of the richer countries of Europe, that was introduced 2 years ago, and also, of course, many local experiments, which is very interesting. But in Europe, I would say it's an ongoing debate between those who believe that it's the appropriate answer to the dynamic of capitalism. If the capitalism now is unable to promote growth, is unable to promote equalities between people, etc., is unable to provide full employment, then that would be necessary to cut the link between employment and income. But you have also those who keep believing that that unemployment must be challenged by specific policies, not only employment policies, but also tax policy for it, and should admit collective rather than individual responses. So, of course, the design of this kind of universal basic scheme is important and must be taken in consideration. This kind of scheme must certainly not be used as, and I will belong to this to the ones who are in doubt with the need to set up for every country the universal basic income, because I think this kind of scheme must not be used as an instrument to increase job precariousness, must not be used to increase employers' power or to damage the existing social production systems in our countries. For example, a 2-week universal basic income will not properly, I think, challenge poverty and inequalities. How to be sure that this kind of universal basic scheme will not have perverse effects on employment and work, and will not contribute to downgrade the situation of labor market insiders, for example, without reinforcing necessarily that of labor market outsiders. So I think what you say in France, it's a response of Normandy guys, huh? No, neither yes, neither no. I think the question is still open and must be tackled differently according to the economic situation of each country, the importance of unemployment, of the informal sector as well. But I don't see it as a, let's say, as a reliable answer for the European Union as a whole, for example. That would be my answer. But I would be glad to listen to the experience of Brazil from this point of view.
Thank you very much, Professor Catherine, for the answers. And I will open the floor for other questions. Professor Elena just told me she would like to make a question. So I pass the word to Professor Elena. In the meantime, others who feel motivated to ask questions, either speaking or writing them down, please do so. Please open your mic. Yes.
Hello, everybody. First of all, I would like to congratulate and give our best thanks to Catherine and also Lucia for your comprehensive presentations and for sharing with us the main findings of your research efforts. Actually, I had a list of questions, but I will stick to two. In the first place, Kath, would you please tell us about how do you see the suggestion coming from different parts of the world, and also particularly from France, of organizing health and other essential public services as commons, and therefore changing the forms of organizing and providing the service, and also avoiding problems with employment, as you mentioned, and attempts of privatizing these services, as it is always occurring in Brazil. The second thing that I would like to hear about how you would react to that is that I believe that one of the lessons that this pandemic brings to us is to stimulate us economists and also other professionals to pay attention not only to health per se, but its production system. And of course, health presents indeed important differentials if seen as a production activity. Differently from others, this activity by definition is distributed throughout the territories. And this makes a huge difference. But how do you see the limits of telemedicine that you mentioned and digitalization in, first, reducing this intrinsic importance of this proximity between production and consumers, those who produce and those who consume health services? And also in terms of replacing doctors and other professionals, so the workforce working in health. And I guess, Kath, that you also mentioned that the health industry is more... Sorry? Can I continue? And I think that you also mentioned that the health industry is more sustainable than others. And of course, when we talk about sustainability, we first think of on the social dimension. But could you please elaborate, give us some more information about this issue? Thank you very much indeed for being with us today.
Thank you. So, what about organizing differently the healthcare system and make a break in privatization, etc., etc.? I think the response is not a technical response. Oh, sorry, my phone is. If we look at the French situation before the pandemic, all these trends that I was speaking about, privatization, the development of ambulatory services, the regime, etc., all these trends were occurring, of course, have been occurring in the French health system since, let's say, the 1980s. But what was very interesting, just before the pandemic, was that we had a big fight of hospitals, of healthcare professionals, and nurses, it's true, nurses particularly, a big fight against these policies, against reducing the cost, reducing the number of beds, reducing the length of hospital stay, etc., etc. And I think, and then came the pandemic. So there was a response from the French government to this big fight, but the response was very, very, very weak. I mean, in terms of gratifications, in terms of wages, in terms of all these kind of benefits. And as I say, the pandemic didn't see much conflicts because the healthcare professional were so involved in their daily work, helping people to recover and etc. That there was no conflict. But I am sure that the conflicts will reappear after the pandemic. Well, when it will stop, let's guess quickly. So of course the organization of the healthcare system must be tackled, and the privatization must be stopped, and also the kind of administrative management of hospital where management principle prevail upon the doctor's decision, and etc., etc. But when I say there is no technical, and we must invest in health, and I think it will be one of the big lessons of the pandemic, because it's also a big part of employment in the countries. Health is a very important sector in terms of employment, but for that we will need conflicts. I mean, to force governments to change the organization of health system and to stop this kind of downgrading hospital systems and quality, etc., etc. So I am convinced that we need, of course, big organizational system change, and this change occurred during the pandemic. For example, during the pandemic, the healthcare professional took the lead. I mean, and the managers of hospitals, they were totally absent. I mean, so we have to keep this kind of thing in mind, and I'm sure that when the pandemic will be stopped, we will see other fights and etc. And I hope that for example, maybe you've heard of the French population on the terrace applauding to the healthcare workforce, etc. During the first wave, because it's no longer during this wave, but it's not sufficient to applaud. I mean, we have to be on the side of these people who are fighting for a better healthcare organization and a better care condition for patients, etc., etc. So that will be my answer to your questions. And of course, you have to pay attention. And that's why in this special issue of IRES, we chose to pay attention not only to care, to hospital care or the way care was delivered, etc., but also to medical equipment and the state of the productive system regarding its capacity to be autonomous and to produce medical equipments needed during this kind of shocks, of pandemics, etc. And what we have seen, for example, for France, I just published with my colleague Claude Serfati an article about the state of the medical equipment in France and the loss of competition, of French medical manufacturers during the last 20 years, let's say. And it's so we have to pay attention to this kind of thing. And we have also to promote certainly digitalization, telemedicine. Why not? As I say, telemedicine was a way to care for the continuity of care during the pandemic for people who were not able to go to the doctors, etc. But I think telemedicine must not replace the very intimate relationship that people can have with their doctors. So you have to. It can certainly be telemedicine can be developed, but not totally at the expense of this kind of intimate relationship you have with your physicians, etc. What about and not to a point that you would replace doctors or physicians. And for the third point, when I say health industry could require more investments because first healthcare in general and education also are these kind of sectors that produce common goods, and that common goods are very important to be produced. And as I said, if we can consider that capitalism has been able to produce in an efficient manner consumer goods, etc., it is not able to produce this kind of common goods. And you have to have the state behind investing in this kind of sectors to produce these common goods. And in a context of ecological transition, I think that investing in healthcare or investing in education is less damaging than, for example, supporting. I don't mean that we don't have to support the other manufacturing industries. That's not my point. But I think that it's less damaging because the health sector and healthcare or education is not very much energy consumer, as I said. It doesn't require a lot of energy, etc. So because I think the crisis, the pandemic has slowed down, will slow down the need for ecological transition, because today with the social impacts of the economic and social impact of the pandemic, I think ecological transition will not be the first aim to follow for governments, etc. I think so. In a way, investing in health, investing in education could be an intermediary solution, I would say, before economies should be will be able to recover and to put transitional ecological transition at the first place, I would say.
Well, thank you very much. We don't have other questions. Eventually, the people feel a little shy to ask in English. So, in any way, I think we had a very interesting and long debate. We are now live for 2 hours and 15 minutes, and for sure, we want to give Professor Catherine also a break after speaking so long time and providing us so interesting insights. So thank you very much, and I would pass the word to our coordinator, Professor José, for making the closure.
Well, Catherine, thank you so much for your excellent and provocative exposition. Before, I just want to give you our common friend Jair do Amaral sent us a note that unfortunately couldn't join our discussion because he gives classes at the moment.
Okay.
But he sent you kisses.
Okay.
And as we are going to, this is in our website, YouTube, and he said that he's going to watch it very carefully.
Okay. Okay.
But anyway, thanks so much. It's really fantastic to have you here, and we are looking also forward to read your research in the IRES website.
In a few weeks, I think.
Okay, we certainly will be very pleased to read it, and be sure that we'll be in touch with you much more times in the next couple of months, because we are certainly we need to interact a lot, because your research fits very, very much in the work that we are doing together with the Fundação Oswaldo Cruz.
Wonderful.
As soon as we have a more detailed piece of work about Brazil and about other things, we'll be very glad to send you. We are finishing our first part of the research project, but precisely in this week. Tomorrow we are going to have a very big discussion within the team of Campinas, ourselves, Fiocruz, and we'll certainly be very pleased to interact with you. Thanks so much. Kisses to you, to Francois.
Okay.
We're missing you a lot. Huh? We would like to have a glass of wine.
But we'll have a caipirinha break now.
We'll have a wine break to tomorrow.
Celebrate RedeSist.
Okay, kisses to you, to Francois. Okay. Hola, mon ami. Merci beaucoup. And thanks so much. It's fantastic.
Thank you. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this presentation with you. And I was really happy to be sharing this.
Kisses from myself, Marcelo, Elena, Maria, Maria Lucia. Bye-bye, and thank you very much for the fantastic talk.
Beijos. Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Beijos. Bye-bye.